House of Grey, a podcast-only novel written by Collin Earl, read by Christopher Snellgrove. For more information about the book, please visit houseofgreybook.com. Music for the House of Grey provided by Figure of Fiends. Visit the band at myspace.com/Figure of Fiends. Cover art by James Thane. More information at THAYN.net.
Hey there, this is Chris Snellgrove. Wow, can you believe Monson's the Horumvir? What did he get himself into? Guess you'll have to stick around for episode 3 and find out. Things are buzzing over at houseofgreybook.com. Make sure to add your thoughts after the episode. Hold on tight for Chapter 2. The dean of Collin University was standing placidly in front of the new students. He looked unruffled and regal as he started to speak. His hands were in just the right place, folded neatly in front of him, and he was neither fidgety nor nervous. It was obvious that he wanted to project a certain image right off the bat. The hall got very quiet as all eyes turned towards the dean. "Welcome to Collin University." There was clapping and cheers from the upper decks. "I am Marcus Dayton, Dean and Headmaster of Collin University. This university follows in the proud tradition of other notable schools such as Dayton. Moses Lake High School. Where have I heard that name?" Monson whispered in his head. He thought for a long moment. With a flash of recognition, it came to him. A Dayton came to see him in the hospital, but that Dayton had been a woman. A rather attractive one if his recollection was correct. He watched the dean closely. He and that woman, are they related? "Now that we are all acquainted, I have a few announcements to make." The dean held up a small piece of paper. "As you may know, there has been a substantial amount of publicity in the last few years concerning the school and the behavior of its students. I am very excited to tell you." Casey turned towards Monson. "Dude, he doesn't look very excited, does he?" Monson stopped listening to the dean and focused on his demeanor. The man had an air of a person with better things to do. Despite this haughtiness, strain, almost worry could be seen between the lines on the dean's face. His handsome, perfectly manicured look seemed ruffled just below the surface. His eyes seemed to shift back and forth, as if he was searching for something. Something was happening that this man did not like, and it was apparent that there was not one single thing he could do about it. Still, Monson could not shake the feeling that he knew him. Before he could deduce anything further, the sound of his own name refocused his attention on the dean's long-forgotten speech. "Monson Grey." Monson heard his name and turned his attention back towards the podium. "Is Mr. Grey here?" Monson thought there was something hopeful in his voice, almost as if he was praying that Monson would not answer. Casey prodded him to stand up. "That's you, bro." Monson slowly rose to his feet and felt dozens of eyes falling on him. It was a very disconcerting feeling. Out of the corner of his eye, the fat boy sitting next to him gestured something excitedly to his friend. Monson looked in the eyes of Dean Dayton as a flash of recognition struck him. That woman, Dayton, the one who had come to see him, and this man, they knew each other. They were related somehow. Monson strained, pulling at his tickling memory. A beautiful face, sitting primly in front of many others, all watching him, following his movements. Bright lights, cameras, people, so many people. Cheers. But what were they cheering for? The images rolled over Monson, and then suddenly these images changed. Screams, blood, anger, hatred, so much hatred. The woman's face burst through these other images. Monson finally knew. His scholarship. This man and that woman were both there. Not only that, the dean was one of the panel judges from the Knowledge Bowl last year. Monson was remembering. He glared inwardly as he forced himself to catch hold of the thoughts streaming through his mind. That whole period was still very hazy to him, but that competition happened right before the incident on the bridge. Details still evaded him, but he did not need the details. Something clicked into place for him, effectively garnishing his attention. The Knowledge Bowl, the Hornbeer Scholarship. They were connected. No, not just connected. The Hornbeer thing and that competition were one and the same. That's how he made it into this school. He had won the Hornbeer Scholarship competition. How had he not made that connection all this time? Monson thought back to the long conversations with Molly concerning his big opportunity to go to a very good school. Molly had obviously known this entire time. Where on earth was his head? Mr. Grey has joined us from the Hornbeer academic competition held at the end of last year's term. The dean sounded completely disinterested. His ideas confirmed, Monson tried his best to ignore the students around him, which was proving more and more difficult the more he stood there, exposed. He hoped that if he kept his eyes firmly on Dean Dayton, in spite of the growing murmuring, that maybe the students might lose interest. He thought frantically, why didn't I pay attention when Molly was talking to me? Then I might know what this scholarship business is all about. Furthermore, he is one of the few survivors of the Barty Bridge disaster back in May. We are very lucky to have him here, in good health, and almost whole. I request that you treat him with the utmost respect as a sign of goodwill towards the many people that died that day. He stopped talking there, looking forlorn. Everyone stared, just as Monson expected they would. Various looks shone on their faces. Fear, shock, confusion. The most disturbing, however, was the disgust and disdain that permeated the air around him. He could almost read the minds of the people. He was like the embodiment of the traffic wreck you know you should turn from, but just cannot quite pull your attention away. Again, we welcome you, Mr. Grey, and hope that you find Collin to your liking. Starting second term, he bid Monson to sit down, and he did so, not wasting any time at all. The other students continued to stare periodically. Monson found this annoying, but there was an impression that nagged at him. Though fleeting, he could not help but feel that there was a great deal more to this scholarship business than simple tuition reimbursement. Unpleasantness was going to arise from this. He could feel it, and he was not looking forward to it. Apart from that, he was frustrated at the dean for mentioning Barty Bridge and his appearance, as if he did not have enough trouble with both those issues. He did not need the dean to remind him. He had a living reminder all over his face and body. The whole thing just irritated him. It irritated him a great deal. He did not know why, but for some reason, he continued to search the faces of the students. Perhaps he was hoping to find a friendly face, one that might give him some hope for the future of his school life, which was starting to feel very bleak. Monson searched and found one face that jumped out at him, as if a lamp had lit it up. Sheets of golden blonde hair tied in a half ponytail partially hid the face of a girl with a pair of cool green eyes that were steady and unflinching as they connected to his. Monson and the girl looked at each other for a moment, and then her gaze flickered to either side of him, like she was searching for something. Hey, that's the girl that Molly pointed out in the parking lot earlier, thought Monson, recognizing that half ponytail and white blouse. She was sitting a couple of rows in front of him and to the right, surrounded by a crowd of both female and male students. All seemed to be jockeying for her attention. To the girl she responded, but seemed to take little interest in what they had to say. She took even less interest in the boys that were trying to catch her eye. She continued to look at Monson coolly for another brief moment, then turned back to the group. Casey again leaned towards Monson. Kylie Cormack. What? Her name is Kylie Cormack. Casey gestured towards the girl.
She attended St. Brown with Artorius and I, although she's a year older. She went to some school in Spain last year. I don't know why she decided to come here now. Can't say I'm surprised, though. It's just like her to change her mind and inconvenience her whole...
He stopped suddenly, looking distracted. He righted himself, continuing in a more controlled voice.
Her family is old money, and is very much a part of the upper crust. And if you couldn't tell, her personality leaves you totally wanting.
Leaves you wanting? Monson did not understand. What does that mean?
I mean, her personality leaves you wanting to get away from her. She's cute, though.
Artorius craned his neck to get a look at her.
Yeah, with all the compassion of a fence post, and not even a particularly nice fence post.
Monson turned and caught Artorius' eye as he shook his head and silently mouthed, "I'll explain later." All three boys' attention returned to the dean, who continued to talk about the high standards expected at Collin, free time, and certain conditions where a student could leave the campus, but only with permission. The dean rounded off his speech with a discussion of the Legion. Monson's new friends did not mention Kylie again. While this was obviously a sore subject, Monson could not help but notice that Casey continued to glare at her, albeit as covertly as possible. Hearing the dean's voice again pulled him from this contemplation. He hoped he had not missed anything important. "I want all of you to understand how important competition is to the faculty and the sponsors here at Collin. Understand that this school is the standard in primary education, and the resources expended on your behalf are vast. Failure is not tolerated." The dean looked around imperiously, stopping for a fraction of a second longer on Monson. "You should be aware of the policies at Collin. Expulsion is something that is used here with frequentness. Now, while I expect all of you to understand each and every rule about this school and about all of the classes and..." Casey snickered. "Dude, is that even a word?" He looked at Monson and Artorius. "I think so." Monson scratched his chin. "Sounds pretty funny in that sentence, though, doesn't it?"
"I think frequency is what he's looking for."
"Or frequently." They debated that point until the end of Dean Dayton's speech. Others sitting behind the dean, including Coach Abel, the Legion's coach, came forward to speak. Abel was a frumpy-looking man who was head of the athletics and academic support departments. A couple of the different department heads followed him, though the boys did not actually listen to any of them. When the new students were all thoroughly bored, the dean made his way again towards the podium. "I want you all to remember that we support each other here at this school. My door is always open. I encourage you to use it." Monson laughed to himself. "Yeah, right." He watched the way the dean's jaw constricted as he said this. "I'm sure you're just dying for all of us to come see you," he said to himself.
"That's a PR dance if I've ever seen one."
"Yeah, remind me never to seek his advice." The dean, after a round of polite applause, left the stage. Many of the students only clapped a few times before they went back to conversing among themselves. Yet the speeches were not finished. Some administrative advisor spoke at length, talking about classes, the support system, dorms, and interpersonal relations.
Dude, does she mean like dating?
Casey was completely amused as the rigid-looking woman spoke solemnly about propriety and discretion.
Why did she refer to it as interpersonal relations?
Who knows? Maybe it embarrasses her. After the painful speech about interpersonal relations, Mark and Gat, who looked just as bored as everyone else in the room, jumped up to the platform. "Now, if all of you will kindly stand up and make your way down to the center path, I will show you to your dormitory. Parents, you may follow Eden." He pointed up towards the balcony and a man that was standing off to one side.
He will show you where you can meet back up with the students."
All the students stood up and languished in confusion for a few minutes as they gathered their luggage. They slowly started to move toward the raised platform. Artorius and Casey started up their conversation again about football. Monson, not knowing much about the subject, just let his thoughts roam as the crowd of people steered him and his companions down the light-studded path. The crowd made their way closer and closer to the platform when it happened. Something very distinct touched him, but it was not something normal. In fact, Monson did not know what it was. It made his neck hairs prickle. He was finding it difficult to articulate in his mind all of the effects it had on him. The hustle and bustle of chattering students was very distracting, but something had brushed his skin. When this intrusion, which was the only word he could use to describe the feeling, came over him, it seemed to bypass a part of him, stepping past the simple and piety fears that burdened him daily and connected deeper and deeper until it caught hold of that inner self, the part that he kept hidden from everyone. He gave himself a little shake, at the same time thinking that in his head, this sounded a lot more mystical than it probably really was. This feeling was most likely a byproduct of his injury, nothing more. Probably a function of his unconscious telling him to remember something. Still, he did not like the idea of a mental episode jacking with his current peace of mind. This was a new place, and he did not want to deal with the past quite yet. Monson could not ponder this new development long. The intrusion was gone, and left just as abruptly as it had come. Monson felt a burning within his depths. Maybe this was something more than he thought. He looked wildly around for what could have caused such an odd feeling. He looked for a trigger, something that started such a stir within him. He was disappointed when he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Someone touched him. He knew it. This intrusion came from that contact. Why was this just now occurring to him? Was it like something that would kickstart his memory? Suddenly it made total sense. He tried fruitlessly to brush up against the skin of some of the people in his immediate area. This was a mistake. It yielded nothing more than a few glares, a couple of grimaces, one really confused look, and one big smile from a cute, dimpled girl. She blushed crimson as she noticed what he was doing. He stepped back, but she continued to smile, looking embarrassed. Despite his search for the source of whatever that feeling was, he could not help but gape at the girl. "Hello?" he thought. "Why are you smiling at me? I'm a scarred mess." The girl continued to look at him, appearing intrigued. Nothing else significant happened. Defeated, he closed his eyes, trying to recount the exact feelings and images that occurred. Feelings resurfaced, though dim and disjointed. They rematerialized and they felt almost like a probe. That's the feeling he recognized. That must have been the trace effects of the intrusion. Along with these feelings, images of a dark curtain of glossy material came dimly to the forefront of his mind. He wanted to work out more about the experience. Maybe if he concentrated on what happened to him, he would be able to understand more. However, with all this pondering, he was now not paying attention to where he was going. He tripped and triggered a chain reaction that sent students and luggage flying in every direction. It was pandemonium. Bags and people toppled like dominoes, spilling everywhere. Monson rolled down several steps until he landed on something soft. There were groans and moaning coming from all around as people tried to figure out what had happened. Monson heard Casey from behind him, his voice a mix of horror and suppressed laughter.
"Grey, are you okay?"
Monson did not answer. He could not answer. A smell, pure and sweet, enveloped his senses, making him slightly lightheaded. Yet there was something wrong. Monson opened his eyes. Revelation came swiftly, and with all the force of a blunt axe went a voice, muffled and distraught, pleaded,
"Do you think you could get off me, please?"
Monson shook the fuzziness from his head and saw a tousled sheet of blonde hair pulled back in a erect half ponytail. Kylie Cormack looked with soft green eyes directly into his and whispered very quietly,
"You're hurting my back."
He stared at her. She stared back. People began to gather around them. He saw distaste creep onto her features as she looked around at the gathering crowd, though something about it felt forced. He continued to watch her reaction to him. He watched her become suddenly disgusted by his appearance and made no attempt to hide it.
Oh, sorry.
Monson scrambled to his feet.
I wasn't.
He trailed off, not knowing what to say.
"Oh, I see,"
she said with a surprising amount of sympathy.
"You weren't paying attention to where you were going, right?"
Monson started to squirm. The crowd of girls that had been sitting with Kylie during the orientation started to move in behind her as she stood and brushed herself off. Many of them were bearing minor injuries themselves. Obviously, they too suffered from Monson's misstep. They stood behind her, whispering behind hands and shooting him venomous looks.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't paying attention. Look, I'm really sorry I knocked you over." "You're sorry?"
This time, there was not even a trace of sympathy.
"You are sorry." "Well, I guess if you're sorry..."
Monson could hear the malice now in her voice. She paused.
"Do you realize what you have done?"
She began yelling now, angry flushes starting to creep up her neck and face.
No. Should I?"
Behind Kylie, different girls clapped their hands to their mouths, looking scandalized. Kylie's face completed the morph, growing more and more angry. As her face started to contort, her skin went blotchy. Monson could see the stress lines forming at the base of her neck. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Apparently, the severity of his crime was so gruesome, it left her momentarily speechless. Abruptly, as if an imaginary dam burst within her, Kylie bellowed while pointing to a spot over Monson's shoulder.
"Damien's first impression! You ruined it!"
With this statement, many of the girls behind Kylie started to look around wildly. Then, in one fluid motion, all looked over Monson's right shoulder. On a side balcony, overlooking Monson and the assortment of girls, stood about a dozen boys watching with amusement on their faces. He turned and looked straight into the face of a boy who appeared to be the leader. He recognized him immediately. Damien Peterson, the Diamond. That boy is the one he beat in the Knowledge Bowl. That is who he beat to become the Hormveer. Monson looked for a moment, disbelief etched on his face. Not only did he remember the boy's face, but also details about him. He was a star, probably one of the most talented athletes the school had ever seen. But he was also on scholarship, right? How did he get back in? How did he afford it? The Diamond looked at him for a moment. His glare was unrecognizable. That second felt like a lifetime for Monson. They both just stood looking at one another. Wait, did the Diamond just wave? Monson must have imagined it, or maybe misunderstood. Damien broke their eye contact and gestured to his friends, who started to move towards the back of the balcony.
"I only had one chance to leave a first impression."
Her attention snapped back on Monson, who gave a little start. He had almost forgot the current situation.
"I will never get another chance to make a good first impression on Damien."
She straightened herself up. Those cool green eyes seemed to crackle with electricity.
"And you, in turn, will never get another chance to impress me. I hope you're happy."
She stormed off, her gang of girls in tow, walking towards the exit where Mr. Gatt was still waiting. The audience of students, who until now stood captivated, almost caused another uproar in their haste to move out of the way of the obviously enraged girl. Many people, unsure who to stare at, gaped from the raging girl to the scarred, confused boy, shocked and delighted at the high school-type drama unfolding before them. Monson felt winded, as if a pro boxer had just let him have it. He was not sure if he should laugh or be really upset. He turned to Casey, who looked more serious than Monson could have thought possible. A very edgy, almost dangerous look inched its way onto his face. He looked like a tiger ready to pounce. Artorius had a grimace, a very serious grimace. Before Monson, Artorius, or even Casey could say anything about the encounter, someone touched Monson on the back. He spun swiftly, expecting to see some new impending disaster dropped at his feet. Mr. Gatt stood calmly in front of him, with no pretense or greeting. "Well, Mr. Grey, it appears that we are going to have to work on your people skills." "You certainly do have a way with the ladies, Mr. Grey." Monson, Artorius, and Casey walked beside Mr. Gatt. Artorius and Casey laughed at the comment. It helped to ease the potent tension still pooling from their encounter with Kylie. Monson, however, just scowled. "Honestly, the way she was yelling at me, you'd have thought I'd, murdered her cat or something." "That's just how she is. You should have seen it when Casey and she—" "Arthur, we really don't need to talk about that." "Oh, come on." Artorius had a malicious grin on his face. "It's such a good story." "Yeah, Casey, what's with you two? And don't try and deny it. I know what I saw back there. You guys have a past. Spill it." "Dude, now is not the time, nor the place." Casey gave Mr. Gatt a quick sideways glance. Mr. Gatt chuckled. "Please, do not let me stop you. As a matter of fact, I'm fairly curious myself. I like to know what motivates my students." This was obviously not what Casey wanted to hear. "It's such a long, boring story." Casey looked flushed and uncomfortable. Monson opened his mouth to encourage him, but before he could say anything, Mr. Gatt cut him off. "Do not worry, lad. This is not something that has to be shared now. Perhaps another time." Casey looked at him, relief starting to dull the red color that had overtaken his face. They pressed on, picking up their pace a little bit. Mr. Gatt did not talk much as he led the three boys to their dormitory. This was perfectly okay with Monson, as quiet was not something that bothered him. Casey was chatting up a storm, telling Artorius about his summer, the places he had visited, the girls he had met, and a bundle of other things, all of which sounded exaggerated. Some of his explanations just seemed a little far-fetched to be real. Artorius seemed content to just listen, as Casey drove headlong into a story about a trip to Rome. Monson stopped listening there. There was more than enough cultural discussion going on, and there would probably be a lot more in the future, especially considering the nature of this school. Plus, there was this odd hunch Monson had. He bet he would probably hear this story more than once. Casey seemed like a storyteller, so he decided he would get to know Mr. Gatt a little better. "So, how long have you worked here, Mr. Gatt?" To Monson's surprise, Mr. Gatt let out a laugh, and it was not just a token giggle. Monson observed, but did not think it right to comment, that it was probably a good thing Mr. Gatt had not been drinking at the moment, as it would have come flying out his nose. Mr. Gatt sure was a strange man. The man laughed for a minute or so, then wiped a tear from his eye. "Well, young man, that is quite the question, and I suppose it depends on what you mean." This was not the answer Monson had expected. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Gatt. My apologies. My own little joke?" He cleared his throat. "I guess I was inquiring if you wanted to know how long I've actually been here, or how long it feels." Monson looked perplexed. Well, I guess I mean how long you've actually been here.
About 25 years, on and off. Although, it feels much, much longer than that.
Now Monson was thoroughly confused. He did not understand what was so funny about working at Collin for 25 years. He also could not help but feel amazed. Mr. Gatt did not look that old. His hair threw you off, but his face boasted late 30s at most. Markin Gatt looked at him, a fatherly expression on his face.
Mr. Grey, Monson, this is a world of privilege, and with those privileges there are certain expectations and norms one must follow.
So why is that funny?
Use your head for a moment. What happens in a society that is highly restricted by rules and regulations when someone within that society does not conform?
I have no idea. That person is thrown out?
Markin Gatt laughed again. In a way, their interactions are definitely constricted. However, they are not thrown out, especially in a society like this one. He stopped for a second, spun around on the balls of his feet, and pointed to the surroundings. These people would not throw anyone out physically. It's not in vogue. Monson raised an eyebrow. He was not really sure what Mr. Gatt was talking about. Who are these people? The voice in his head asked. Do not worry, my young friend. You are a bright one. You will understand what I am talking about, eventually.
Monson could not think of anything to say in answer to that, so he thought a change in subject was in order.
So, you said that you've been here off and on for 25 years, right? Yes, that is correct.
And what were you doing when you weren't teaching?
Adventuring.
Monson blinked, swearing that he must have heard wrong. He thought, adventuring? Is that even something you can do? What qualifies as adventuring?
Have you ever seen any of the Indiana Jones films?
Actually, Monson had seen the first one. It was a good flick. He looked at Mr. Gatt suspiciously.
I've seen one of those movies. Why do you ask? Consider me a real-life Dr. Jones.
He looked rather satisfied with himself.
That is what I do when I am not here. It is all very exciting.
Then why are you back here?
Monson wondered why he would come back here when it was very obvious that he found this place distasteful. The question was simple, but seemed important. Research.
Research? Thought Monson. What kind of research would bring him back to this rich kid school? Monson wanted to ask more, as the subject was nudging his curiosity, but Mr. Gatt cut in before he could say anything.
Never mind. Just forget the ramblings of an old man. Do not give it a second thought.
Surprised at the sudden end of the conversation, Monson stared at Mr. Gatt at a loss of what to say. Another one of those fleeting impressions assaulted him. He missed something important. Maybe it was the key to understanding Mr. Gatt, but for the life of him he could not see what it was. Again, Monson had the feeling that Markin Gatt certainly was a strange man. The walk to the dorm seemed to take almost no time at all, even though Monson knew it was on the other side of Collin's sizable campus. He was starting to feel more comfortable. It was nice to be out of the spotlight for the time being. He was starting to like Collin, even if the entire campus had an almost prison-like feel, with the rock walls and such. Almost to counteract this, the trees and grassy knolls were spread out enough to give the impression of wide-open spaces. Certainly at times, you almost forgot that you were even on school grounds. The campus displayed a great abundance of the now recognizable, stylized mixed architecture, the same that was so apparent in the modern Colosseum. Massive and beautifully expensive, it was not hard to see what Collin's board of directors was trying to do with these particular structures. However, something felt like it was missing from the overall effect. It was not something easily put into words. Monson was not exactly sure what was wrong. Maybe it was the other types of buildings scattered across the campus. These buildings, many of which looked like homes, had a very Victorian feel, definitely 18th century, maybe into the early 19th. These homes or buildings, or whatever they were, did not sit well with the Romanized themes so carefully embedded into the grain of the school's character. The more he thought about them, the more it seemed that he did not mind them. As he looked at the older buildings, he felt comforted. He was not sure why he felt this way. They were just buildings after all. But these buildings felt full of history and wisdom. Monson felt almost envious. The two traits he prized most, neither of which he felt he had. After about 15 minutes of walking, Monson, Mr. Gatt, Artorius, and Casey all arrived at a very curious building. This building, more than any other they had seen thus far, exhibited a true blend of both the ancient and modern architecture. It had a peculiar, for lack of a better word, essence. Its decor was very pleasant, with white brick walkways lined with lighted stone columns that matched perfectly with the gray sculpted granite of the building's infrastructure. This highly ornamental stone blended seamlessly with the wooden portions of the building and gave off an aura of style and attitude. The bottom floor abandoned the stone and wood material of the rest of the building and carefully wrapped the base of the structure in huge windows. Inside, a kind of indoor atrium was easily visible from the walkway. A large bush wall encircled the building, giving it a secluded feeling, as if this place was a world apart from the rest, or a refuge of some sort. Mr. Gatt, moving quickly, continued to walk until he came to a three-way fork in the walkway. Preceding the fork, ever so slightly, was a large, finely carved stone arch. He stopped directly under the arch and turned to look at the three boys. "Welcome to the barracks, boys." Mr. Gatt bowed. "I will now present the Horumvir to his prepared quarters." Monson, Casey, and Artorius gave each other inquisitive looks, taken aback by the formal way in which Mr. Gatt spoke to them. Monson recovered first. Mr. Gatt? Why exactly are you talking like that?" Mr. Gatt gave him a warm smile and put his hand on his shoulder. With a little squeeze, "I'm sorry about that. I guess it's a habit. There is normally a kind of ceremony called the induction. It is when the students and parents meet in the indoor atrium to see the new or existing Horumvir ascend to his quarters." He took his hand off Monson and placed it on his own chest. "I am usually the master of ceremonies at the induction. The formality is a hard habit to break." "Dude, that's weird." Casey stepped away from the arch and moved a bit closer to both Monson and Mr. Gatt. He looked around, tracing the stone walkway with his eyes, as if to see if people were hiding in the bushes. "What happened to the ceremony this year?" Monson's winning of the Horumvir scholarship was something of a surprise, you might say. He looked down, trying to avoid meeting their eyes. "What does that have to do with anything?" Casey's eyes narrowed. "There you are." It was Molly. She jogged up to the small group looking winded. "Oh, I'm so glad I found you. I was going to wait for you in the atrium, but then I realized they weren't having the ceremony this year." "Molly!" Monson moved to steady her. She had been moving very fast for such a large woman. "Hey, are you all right?" "Hey there, love." She caught her breath. "I'm fine. I'm just glad I didn't miss you." "What? Did you think I was going to let you leave without saying goodbye? Don't be silly." Molly smiled at his pitiful attempt at humor. "You're such a sweet boy. I am going to miss you." "Me too." It was true. He was going to miss her. She had been his rock for the past few months, one of the only connections to his past, and for a time, his only friend. Monson suddenly felt sad, really sad in fact. He was going to miss this woman a great deal more than he was willing to admit. Molly again smiled at him, her eyes looking glossy. She surprised him when she put her hand gently on his face, touching his scars lightly. She kissed him gently on the forehead. Monson looked at her. Molly had never displayed this kind of affection. Smiles and positive thinking, that was Molly. That is how he understood her. Now she was emotional, and he did not understand why. As if this was not weird enough, he received another shock when he heard a slight sniff. Confused, he looked into her big dark eyes and gasped. Tears were starting to flow liberally, making her eyes and cheeks puff. She sniffed again. He looked to Artorius and Casey. They just stared back at him, obviously more confused than he was. "Molly?" He tried to keep the concern and confusion out of his voice. "Shh." She pulled a small bag out of her pocket. "Monson, honey, I have a gift for you. It's something very important to your family, so I want you to promise me that you will always wear it." Hands slightly trembling, she handed the bag to him, tears still in her eyes. Apprehensive, Monson took the small cloth bag and opened it. It contained a small square box, the same type that would hold an engagement or anniversary gift. Monson held up the box. "Are you asking for my hand in marriage, Molly? Because I am flattered, but I'm not sure I'm your type." Everyone laughed, including Molly. This went on for a moment and helped to relieve some of the still building tension. She was still giggling. "Just open the box, smartass." He did just that. He gawked as he beheld a large, deep silver-like stone. Monson looked at Molly, waves of disbelief emanating from him. "Well?" Her voice became less emotional and more dignified. "Examine it. Get to know each other." On this enigmatic note, Monson started his scrutiny of the stone. If he had to pick a word to describe it, deep was the only adjective that readily came to mind. To describe this stone, which was more like a gem than an actual stone, with any other word left your mind looking for more, like there was a space missing between the description and the actual object. Its color, bright, penetrating silver, was not dark or light, as it seemed to embody them both. The stone was transparent. Like if it was held up to the light, you could see right through it. Yet, the distance within the stone seemed vast and changing, like the material just below the surface was constantly shifting. It was one of the most mysterious and beautiful things Monson had ever seen. "It was your grandfather's. He told me to hang on to it. I want you to take very good care of it. You may need it someday, and it was very important to him." "Molly, Molly put a finger to her lips, causing him to go quiet immediately. She took the stone from the box and said with a tone of apprehension, "Will you accept this gift, Monson Grey?" "Of course I'll accept it." Monson was unable to control his excitement. He took the stone from Molly with antsy fingers. Her nightly presentation was almost as if she was a queen from some far-off country or something, while he was playing the champion, doing all in his power to fight for her country. He could not understand the bizarreness of her behavior. It was strange, even for her. Regardless, he wanted the stone, not only for its beauty, but also for something deeper. It had belonged to his grandfather. He had very few things from his grandfather. He could not pass on this opportunity. "Well then, let's see it on." She gestured for him to return it. He gave it back to her and turned around as she motioned for him to do so. He could not see what she was doing behind his back, but waited patiently for her to finish. After another moment or so, a silver chain appeared around his neck with a stone clasped in the middle. It was in that exact moment that Monson finally felt at ease. It was a strange way to feel, but something about Molly's demeanor, her formality, and even the stone itself gave him a feeling of hope. That feeling had been lost to him for some time, a feeling that now tasted bittersweet. Monson smiled as he looked from the stone around his neck to his two new friends, to Mr. Gatt, and then finally to Molly. As corny as it sounded, he was glad they were all there. There was nothing left to say. Monson smiled, then put out his hand to shake Molly's, who was looking relieved for some reason. Molly, however, abandoning all her pretenses, threw her arms around him and squeezed him as if her life depended on it. He thought he heard something along the line of, "I'm so proud of you," between the sobs, but he could not be sure. He also felt her tracing little lines like interlocking circles around his neck, something he knew she did when she was nervous. After a minute or so, she broke the bear hug and, still sobbing, turned to leave. Monson caught her arm and gave her another hug. "I'll see you at Christmas." He gave her a final squeeze. "Of course." Molly pulled away and wiped her tears. "Have a great term, and be good." With that ending thought, she started toward the other side of campus to the parking lot. After a short distance, she turned and waved energetically, beaming. It was odd, but something told Monson that he was not the only one she was waving to.
Dude, you and your mom have a really weird relationship.
Casey looked perplexed, which put a very funny look on his face. This in turn made Monson snicker.
Oh, right.
Monson smacked his forehead.
I forgot. You guys wouldn't know.
Wouldn't know what, dude?
Molly isn't my mother.
Okay.
Then who is she?
My lawyer. Everyone except Monson busted out laughing. This continued for a while until they noticed that he was not joining in.
Wait, you're serious?
It's a really long story. It's kind of depressing too, so let's not talk about it right now.
Fair enough.
Casey picked up his bags.
Okay, but I gotta hear this story.
Why would you be so interested in Molly?
Well, she was crying.
Yeah? What does that have to do with anything?
My dad's a lawyer. I wasn't aware that lawyers could cry.
They all laughed this time.
Mr. Gatt?
Casey moved towards him.
I believe you were going to show us our accommodations.
That I was, Mr. K. He bowed again. If you will please follow me. After they gathered their stuff, the three boys and Mr. Gatt moved through the arch and down the center pathway toward the indoor atrium. This will be your entrance, explained Mr. Gatt, looking over to Monson. It provides easier access than attempting to navigate the entire dormitory. Mr. Gatt took all three boys through large glass double doors and started up a red brick path towards the center of the atrium. The boys followed, taking in the finely crafted landscape, marveling at the symbolized Roman gods, and especially, wow, that's amazing! There were statues, tons of them. Stone depictions of heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, all on the bottom floor of the students' dorm. At the very center of the atrium, a large ornate fountain with dozens of spouting veins of water captured his attention. It was magnificent, a marvel of sorts. On top of the fountain sat a statue of a man. He looked both regal and proud, with chiseled muscles and sharp features. The finely shaped face, especially the eyes, displayed all the care of a master mason. This work, this art, showed talent of unparalleled quality. The statue stood around 12 feet high and probably weighed a couple of tons. Spotlights illuminated the statue, similar to the smaller statues he saw on their way into campus. He could not help but notice the placement and size of this particular statue. It was probably an attempt to display its symbolic importance. Size does matter in these things. The bigger it is, the more noticeable it becomes. Monson again looked up the height of the statue. This definitely was noticeable.
Jupiter.
"Oh!" exclaimed Monson, comprehension finally hitting him.
Of course,
he thought.
Whom better than the king of the gods to watch over the students?
The old myths and legends of antiquity were one of the things that Monson enjoyed most about history. The gods especially were something of interest. Monson had asked himself more than once what it would be like to have almost infinite power at your fingertips and still possess all the inaccuracies and contradictions that are so much a part of the human condition. He remembered the phrase, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." Monson had wondered if that was true.
What an idea,
he said to himself. He took a step closer to the fountain to examine the fine detail and the smooth marble of the figure. He really liked the statue.
So, who's this guy supposed to be?
Jupiter.
Dude, how'd you know that?
Well, Artorius started to grin. The huge thunderbolt? That was my first clue. Then, of course, there was the second clue, where Mr. Gatz said it was Jupiter. Casey was not amused. Monson thought that he heard Mr. Gatz stifle a laugh. However, at that exact moment, Mr. Gatz spoke, and his voice sounded quite level, causing Monson to think he must have imagined it.
Over here, please. The Hornbeer's entrance is right around the corner.
Casey and Artorius grabbed their stuff and started after Mr. Gat. Monson, however, stood for a moment more, gazing at the stunning statue. He looked up into the blank staring face of Jupiter, king of the gods, and shuddered. Despite his interest in it, the statue gave him an odd feeling.
Dude, Monson, hurry up, or we're gonna be late.
Casey's voice sounded a short distance off. Monson called after him.
Late? Late for what?
Nothing came in response. Turning his back to the king of the gods, Monson hurried after the others. The entrance to the Hornbeer's quarters was a small elevator found in one of the corners of the indoor atrium. Monson inserted his keycard into the slot and the doors opened with a ding. It was a little cramped, but after a few minutes of arranging Monson, Casey, Artorius, Mr. Gat, and all their luggage, the elevator was successfully cruising upward to the very top floor of the barracks. They talked very little as they rode up the 15 floors. Cramped and uncomfortable, talking seemed like a luxury they could forego at the moment. After a few very sore minutes, everyone wished wholeheartedly that they had come in 2 trips. The elevator screeched to a halt, and the doors opened, causing everyone and everything to tumble out of the elevator. Everyone, that is, except Mr. Gat. Being the closest to the door, Monson fell first. He spilled forward, hitting the ground hard. He looked up at the wrong time, just as Artorius and Casey lost their balance. He shuddered as they came gushing out after him. After some frenzied confusion, the boys pulled themselves together. In the midst of the commotion, a very odd-looking man came rushing to their side, totally catching them off guard. He was skinny, to the point of bony, with very long fingers, high cheekbones, and thin eyebrows. He also had a kind of rigid eloquence that screamed of unwavering strictness. Despite this, he looked at them with very kind eyes that were brown with hints of green.
Ah, Brian!
Mr. Gat extended his hand, stepping over the tangled bodies and luggage.
I was wondering where you had scampered off to. Markin.
Brian extended his own hand and shook Mr. Gat's vigorously.
It has taken you a great deal longer than I had expected. I thought you might be in the comfort room with the other students and parents, so I went to investigate.
Thank you for your concern. It was not an issue. An unexpected turn of events, you might say. Mr. Gat let go a slight chuckle.
Let me introduce you to the new Horambir, Monson Grey. Hero.
Brian gave Monson a slight bow.
I am very pleased to make your acquaintance.
Hero? Why are you calling me Hero? Brian looked slightly shocked.
Hero? Have you not been told what Horambir means?
Nope, don't think so.
Horambir is Latin for hero. Well, actually, the hero.
Monson raised an eyebrow. He wondered to himself,
The hero, huh?
how corny is that?
Hero,
said Brian again, interrupting Monson's thoughts.
Please allow me to show you to your quarters. You are in for quite the treat. You two, please follow me.
Mr. Gatt looked at Casey and Artorius.
I will show you to your rooms. You got it, dude.
Casey finished gathering his scattered possessions.
We'll hook up with you later, hero.
He looked highly amused. With that, the two boys followed Mr. Gatt down the hall and out of sight.
You've been listening to the podcast-only novel The House of Grey by Collin Earl. For more news, information, and updates, please visit houseofgreybook.com. Music by Figure of Beans. Visit the band at myspace.com/Figure of Beans. Cover art for The House of Grey provided by James Thane. More information at thayn.net.